is Wednesday, October the 3rd, 2018. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, Helen Keller, a blind and deaf woman whose radical politics will shock and amaze you. Whose story is not just beautiful, but largely forgotten in America, indeed around the world. Before we dig into that, just a quick reminder that this show is brought to you by people like you at patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Folks, I'm sorry, I'm a couple days behind schedule, really not feeling good, even today. But of course, the show must always go on, and so I am pleased to be here today. If you appreciate my efforts, you can go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant, throw a few bucks. I do rely on this income now, so I appreciate everyone and anyone who chips in. If you want to give a little extra, the PayPal button in my website, dissidentpeasant.com. Finally, if you don't have any money, don't fret, don't feel bad. I'm not mad at you. I don't want to be anybody's charity case. Just give me money because you think it's worth it. But if you want to give me money and you just don't have any money, post on Twitter about the show. Maybe go to iTunes, leave a review. Maybe I am Sam Cedar. Tell them you liked a recent episode. Tell them particularly what you liked. Maybe do something like that. Unless you don't want to, in which case you shouldn't do it. Okay, I hate promoting myself, so I'm going to stop. What do you know about Helen Keller? I mean, if you're feeling kind of dark right now, you might know a few jokes that she weirdly remains the punchline for decades after her death. If you're feeling a little bit lighter, you probably know that she was a blind and deaf woman who lived around the turn of the 19th century. Learned to communicate with the world through the efforts of her teacher, Anne Sullivan. If you really paid attention in school, you might even recall the famous scene from The Miracle Worker, a play adapted from Helen Keller's autobiography, where Helen spells the word water with her fingers into Helen's hand, while weeping and pumping water onto Helen's other hand. This really did happen, and was the moment when Helen finally understood that her new friend wasn't just playing games in her hand with her fingers. Keller would write, quote, "Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that WATER meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life." End quote. What else, though? A few more of you might remember or guess through conjecture that she got an education, which she did, and that she advocated for the blind, deaf, and disabled, which she also did. But Helen Keller's life isn't just a lesson in human achievement through persistence, determination, and the efforts of those who give a shit about us to teach us. Helen Keller was a radical communist who was truly a singular character. She who knew hopelessness and despair like no other. She who learned just who tends to go blind and deaf in the world. And she who refused to passively accept the symptoms of capitalist-driven industrialization. On June 27th in 1880, in West Tuscumbia, Alabama, tucked in the far northwest corner of the state, a child was born to the descendants of slavers. Helen Adams Keller's paternal grandmother was Robert E. Lee's second cousin. Her maternal grandfather was a Confederate general, and a turncoat from Massachusetts to boot. Reconstruction is over by this time, of course. That year, the Republican Party in Alabama will fail to even put up a ticket in that year's presidential election for anyone to vote for. The Keller's family was rich enough that they drew an income from a cotton plantation and had live-in servants. So humble beginnings those were not, especially when compared to the vast majority of people's standard of living in Alabama at the time. But you and I know that for each person they have a choice, regardless of where and who they come from. Yes, on the whole, the sons and daughters of privilege and white supremacy turn out to be exactly that. The acorn drops from the nearby tree, right? It's even fair to indict the whole social, cultural, and political systems of the time as encouraging the development of such characters. But as Helen Keller herself once said, there is no king who has not a slave among his ancestors, and no slave who has not had a king among his. Helen was born with all her senses, 10 fingers, 10 toes, the works. But at the age of 19 months, she contracted an illness. Contemporaneously, doctors called it acute congestion of the stomach and brain, which isn't actually a thing, of course. Meningitis or scarlet fever have been speculated to be the culprits. And they took her sight and her hearing both. Though, as she put it, quote, during the first 19 months of my life, I had caught glimpses of broad green fields, a luminous sky, trees and flowers, which the darkness that followed could not wholly blot out. If we have once seen, the day is ours, and what the day has shown. Helen learned acutely through touch. And one might speculate that she was little better than a beast at this point without language, but I don't think that's quite right. She intuitively began to mime and sign crudely. As a toddler, she would simulate buttering slices of bread if she wanted bread, or go play act shivering if she wanted ice cream. At 5, she could fold and put away clothes and distinguish her own clothes from the rest. She could tell when her aunt and uncle had dressed to leave the house by touching them, and would beg to go with them. Helen would also place her hands over the lips of people speaking, but was perplexed by speech for now. I won't dwell much on the strange, lightless dawn of a childhood without knowing any language, sight, or sound, but before I move on from it, there are 2 entities that do need our thanks, in addition to her caring mother and father, for helping little Helen get by before the arrival of her famous tutor. The first and far more important of the 2 was a little girl named Martha Washington. Martha Washington was the daughter of the family's live-in cook. This is, of course, the Redeemer-era South, post-Reconstruction, like I said, and so these servants are black. And though Helen was disabled, she was still a white woman, and she reports with honesty in her autobiography domineering over Martha, who understood all her signs and would nearly always do exactly what Helen wished. She was still her constant companion for a time, and cared for Helen in her own way, surely. Not just with company as they fed the farm birds, or hunted for eggs, or cut each other's hair, but watching over her. The second entity, if you'll forgive me for being a little silly, was an old retired hunter, a grizzled killer with a heart of gold, Belle. Belle was a dog, of course, a setter, and you may say, what's all this now? What's Helen Keller got to do with the family dog? Lots of people got dogs. Lots of dogs love people. Well, I mentioned Belle for a few reasons. The first is that I don't want to bum you out, but it was a lonely existence to live without words or communication. Dogs live without words every day, surrounded by language, most of which they don't really understand, though some words they obviously can, and none of which they can really employ themselves. But they are extremely perceptive and intelligent creatures, and mostly can't help it but love humanity. So doubtless when Helen's frustrations at her aimless existence drove all to tire of her company, Belle was there, to watch for trouble, to snuggle, to tussle and play with. Poor old Belle couldn't understand Helen's finger language, though. Nonetheless, the other reason I bring up Belle here is that Helen would nonetheless keep a dog all her life, because Belle was her first. They never served her as service animals, only companions. But in one article she wrote about what she'd most like to see if her sight were recovered. She wrote, quote, "I should like to look into the loyal, trusting eyes of my dogs, whose warm, tender, and playful friendships are so comforting to me." End quote. One of the few defining feelings of childhood is curiosity, and no dog or child companion was going to satisfy these feelings. As Helen grew from toddler to child, increasing desire to express herself in more complicated and sophisticated ways were more and more a failure, and these failures compounded her frustrations into dramatic outbursts more and more frequently. Her parents searched for help, of course. Her mother found a book, Charles Dickens' American Notes, with its account of the blind and deaf Laura Bridgman's education. Her teacher was long dead, and probably his methods too with him, her mother thought. And even if not, how could they do anything for this little girl in far-off Alabama? But her father brought her all the way to Baltimore to see this awesome oculist guy he'd heard about, a doctor, who said there was nothing he could do to restore her senses, but insisted Helen could be educated. He referred the family to none other than Dr. Alexander Graham Bell. Dr. Bell is usually remembered as the inventor of the telephone and a great many other things, a type of figure Ayn Rand fans kind of enjoy. But Dr. Bell should be remembered for his years of work with the deaf and hearing impaired, too. His foundations and endowments still stand today, and he really did give a shit about it, because he did, not because it paid him. Child Helen, anguished and despairing father in tow, reports she remembers being received with great warmness by Dr. Bell. He understood her signing, which was the surest way to bring joy to her heart, sat her on his lap while she touched his watch, and made it strike for her. Dr. Bell advised Helen's father to write to a Mr. Anagnos, director of the Perkins Institute in Boston, to ask for a teacher that might educate her, which was done at once. A few weeks later, a reply arrived, stating that yes, indeed, they did have someone who would arrive in due course. So it was that on the 3rd of March, 1897, 3 months before Helen's 7th birthday, she met Anne Mansfield Sullivan, a day which Helen called the most important day of her life. Helen Keller was never truly, completely isolated, either before she acquired language or after. She would feel the world and its people, and in particular she had a strong connection to the planet's animals through touch and its plants through scent. She also loved to feel the pulse of rhythm and music, but she had no words to explain any of this as I just did at the moment. Imagine not just a world without light or sound, but without words, the very skeleton of nearly every human thought you've ever had. There would also be no podcasts. This world Anne Sullivan had come to abolish. Anne herself had lost her sight at a young age, and languished in a menial existence as a girl before she received instruction and education, and luckily for her, surgery that significantly restored some of her vision. Because the only exposure to Helen Keller's story for children often occurs in grade school, I think teachers themselves love Helen Keller as a figure not for anything she eventually produced, but because they see in Anne a heroic myth, a figure whom it might be possible for them to emulate. I may be a tad more cynical than I should be as a person, but though this is a myth, and in my opinion not the most interesting aspect of Helen Keller's life story, it remains a beautiful human achievement that, yes, you yourself might one day emulate. You yourself once believed differently than you do now, because you did not know. Some of those beliefs, especially if they persist a long time, can be corrosive, can lead to misery and death. The reason you have been disabused of them, if you have, and the reason you will hopefully continue to learn and grow and change as a person, will not just be through environmental inertia or even a conscious decision on your part to learn. It will also be because someone decided to teach you, because they cared about you in some sense, because they wanted you to be able to learn and change and grow. At its worst, Helen Keller's story is warped into a banal and saccharine morality play about never giving up and how important education is. But at its best, it's a lesson to all who have wisdom and knowledge to spread it, even when it's hard, even when it seems not to matter. Because Helen was a difficult pupil at first, even as many pupils who have all their senses can be. But because Anne never gave up, the whole world was opened up to Helen. She was able to transcend who she once was. And for leftists in particular, or indeed anyone concerned with liberty and justice for all, we owe it to both of them to take heed of their story. The details of Helen's education since this point are some of the only details of her life that are relatively well trod, even beyond the famous water pump scene. But before I race through the next few years of her childhood to adulthood, I will leave you with this quote from Helen on much of the work that occurred next for her and Anne. Quote, "This process was continued for several years. For the deaf child does not learn in a month or even in 2 or 3 years the numberless idioms and expressions used in the simplest daily intercourse. The little hearing child learns these from constant repetition and imitation. The conversation he hears in his home stimulates his mind and suggests topics and calls forth the spontaneous expression of his own thoughts. This natural exchange of ideas is denied to the deaf child. My teacher, realizing this, determined to supply the kinds of stimulus I lacked. This she did by repeating to me as far as possible, verbatim what she heard, and by showing me how I could take part in the conversation. But it was a long time before I ventured to take the initiative, and still longer before I could find something appropriate to say at the right time. The deaf and the blind find it very difficult to acquire the amenities of conversation. How much more this difficulty must be augmented in the case of those who are both blind and deaf. They cannot distinguish the tone of the voice or, without assistance, go up and down the gamut of tones that give significance to words. Nor can they watch the expression of the speaker's face, and a look is often the very soul of what one says." End quote. But in such a way she eagerly, though somewhat slowly, began to learn the names of all the things she had known through touch in her world. She graduated to Anne Sullivan's stories. She asked her what love is. She went to the Perkins School of the Blind in Boston and socialized with other children who could also spell into each other's fingers. By 10, she began to learn to actually speak with help from Anne, though it took many years and constant practice to develop a voice which could be understood by more than her teachers and a few intimate friends and family. She developed a keen literary talent. Mark Twain was a significant admirer, a man who knew his literary talent, I think. And the only subject she didn't much care for was mathematics. These subjects would prove particularly difficult for her to follow, less because of any natural deficit of hers, but because of the peculiar ways geometry and algebra are taught and performed. Simple problems in arithmetic Helen would often solve mentally, skipping the shown work. But for problems which require the employment of formulas, long division, or multi-step solving, etc., you can see how difficult it might be both to learn how to write all of this in Braille, while also learning the subject itself. Through Mark Twain, she was introduced to an oil magnate who paid for her college education. Thusly, she became the first blind and deaf person to ever receive a Bachelor's of Arts degree from Radcliffe College at Harvard University in 1904. Helen Keller was not just a woman of letters or a Platonic figure of perseverance who succeeded despite nearly unthinkable disadvantage. She was also a revolutionary and considered radical in her day, as was Mark Twain for that matter. And both these Americans of letters' radical politics have been forgotten, just as surely as their works were informed by that radicalism. I'm a United States citizen, of course, so if you'll indulge me a bit of harmless patriotism, it seems to me we have a precious few writers of note, and a short and sparse literary tradition when compared to nearly every other nation of the earth. And it is shameful that those whose names most of us can recall have been so sanitized, all the flavor boiled right out of them. Of that last paradise before Helen turned her attentions towards the long struggle of those without against those with too much, she wrote of the summer of 1901 when she was only 21, quote, "As soon as my examinations were over, Miss Sullivan and I hastened to this green nook, where we have a little cottage on one of the 3 lakes for which Wrentham is famous. Here the long sunny days were mine, and all thoughts of work and college in the noisy city were thrust into the background. In Wrentham we caught echoes of what was happening in the world. War, alliance, social conflict. We heard of the cruel, unnecessary fighting in the faraway Pacific, and learned of the struggles going on between capital and labor. We knew that beyond the border of our Eden, men were making history by the sweat of their brows, when they might better make a holiday. But we little heeded these things. These things would pass away. Here were lakes and woods and broad daisy-starred fields and sweet-breathed meadows, and they shall endure forever." End quote. So she felt at the moment, but it was not to last. Naturally, anyone who came through what she did would probably turn their attentions towards others in similar situations, and Helen Keller did indeed study, raise funds, and advocate for the blind and deaf all her life. But quickly in her efforts, she discovered that blindness in particular was not a randomized condition, but concentrated in the lower classes. Men who were blind were often blinded by industrial accident or lack of appropriate medical care. Syphilitic blindness among sex workers and their clients of the early 20th century was an additional risk. Helen wrote, quote, "I have visited sweatshops, factories, crowded slums of New York and Washington. Of course, I could not see the squalor, but if I could not see it, I could smell it. With my own hand, I could feel pinched, dwarfed children tending their younger brothers and sisters while their mothers tended machines in nearby factories." End quote. Some of her best writing is about this shit. She truly had a tender heart and a romantic sensibility that somehow achieves both simplicity and eloquence. Quote, "I do not doubt that many persons who read what I am going to write will say to themselves, 'She is indeed blind. She is so blind she imagines everyone else to be blind.' As a matter of fact, I have been thinking for a long time that most of us are afflicted with spiritual blindness. Certainly very few people open fresh, fearless eyes upon the world they live in. They do not look at anything straight. They have not learned to use their eyes, except in the most rudimentary ways. They will usually see a lamppost, if it is a large one, and sometimes they are able to read the danger signal on a railway crossing, but not always. Most of the time they expect someone else to do their seeing for them. They often pay fabulous sums to lawyers, doctors, ministers, and other experts to do their seeing for them. But unfortunately, it frequently happens that those hired guides and leaders are also blind. Of course, they deny that their sight is imperfect. They claim to have extraordinary powers of vision, and many people believe them. Consequently, they are permitted to lead their fellows. But how often do they steer them to their destruction?" I'm going to leave things here for the moment. Next time, I promise I'll have much more on the radical politics of Helen Keller and how she never wavered in her belief that radical changes to the world were necessary for the well-being of humanity. Next time, the Russian Revolution will occur, and Helen Keller will unabashedly praise the rising star of the East. here to banish capitalism